Ignore it, he muttered, looking about the place. Given the detritus strewn about the inside of the shuttle, it was clear Mabel had spent a fair amount of time here. Fortunately for him, it seemed that her amateur investigations into the shuttle's function weren't too invasive, though he strongly believed the cup holder might never work again after what she'd done to it. You got the ignition switch? He smiled in triumph as the blue-skinned woman produced the fob, which he promptly plugged into the main console. His smile only grew as the internal lights came on with barely a flicker. While that didn't necessarily mean the vehicle was in a fit shape to fly, he'd yet to turn on the grav drive yet. It was a step in the right direction. Slipping into the pilot's seat, his eyes roamed over the shuttle's controls. Not too different from the one with the whisker, he thought. Which meant he could probably pilot it well enough for what he needed. Which wasn't so much a running indictment of his talents as a pilot, as it was the relative simplicity of flying a vehicle equipped with an anti-grav system. In many ways, it wasn't totally unlike driving an automatic car, with only the added complication of an extra dimension to deal with. Still, he wouldn't have even been considering this if it weren't for the fact that Rocket had snuck him aboard the Whisker's shuttle for a go more than once, and that he was desperate. Mostly desperate. The knocking came from the front door again, louder this time. Mabel glanced at him, but he shook his head. Hopefully whoever it was would go away if they ignored them long enough. Of course, that was the moment he heard the front door being broken down. Well, shit. He turned to look up at the hatch. Someone's pretty eager to meet you. Mabel winced at the sound of movement from inside her house. You focus on getting this sky ship flying, she instructed, moving to clamber out of the top hatch. I'll go see what my visitors want. Before Jason could even think to argue, the Orpheum woman was gone. Seeing little recourse but to do what she asked, he started running through the shuttle's pre-flight checklist. Something Rocket had insisted on teaching him in laborious detail. A fact he might have attributed to her seriousness about flight safety, were not for the fact that she'd clearly just been using it as an excuse to lean over him and press her rather ample assets against the back of his head. The memory made him smile, though that quickly turned into a frown as one of the check lights came back a ruddy yellow. Well, I suppose that's to be expected, he thought, as he continued running through the checklist. While the number of yellow lights accompanying the blue weren't great, they weren't terrible either. It just meant the onboard computer system thought those systems weren't functioning optimally, not that they wouldn't function at all. Again, not ideal for what he had planned, but given the shouting that had just started from the other room, it didn't sound like he'd have an opportunity to resolve those issues. Clegg, Mulka Gatsu. He winced at the sound of Mabel talking in rapid-fire Oberynne, echoing from the main house, occasionally answered by a much more halting words in the same tongue, words that came with a very strong accent. And despite the language barrier, it was clear that despite their unfamiliarity with the language, the words they were using were deadly serious. It didn't take a genius to figure out who had come knocking. It was just a shame he didn't know why, though he could think of a few options, not the least of which was that he and Mabel had been spotted coming in. Though given that the Dixie patrol women hadn't started their investigation with shooting, he figured it a pretty safe bet that that wasn't it. The more likely option was that the Dixie were rounding up anyone of political significance within the settlement, either to keep the Orpheans in line, or just to inform them of the change of management. Neither of those options were good for him though, because it meant his chances at flying this floating rust bucket out here without being spotted were now effectively at nil. Though to be fair, that had always likely been the case, but now it looked like he might end up doing it sans Mabel. Because he sincerely doubted the Dixie were going to let her just pop into the boat shed for a minute. His finger hovered over the ignition switch. Something broke in the other room as the sound of a scuffle broke out. His finger continued to hover, even as the Dixie's words took on a distinctly unfriendly tone. What was he even hesitating over this? Mabel would be fine. The Dixie were here for the Imperials, not her. She was also the chief's daughter. Even if she got caught aiding him, she'd probably get out of this with a slap on the wrist. After all, the Dixie weren't about to make an enemy of the local Orpheans. Not if they wanted them to keep quiet about their presence on the world. Of course, they didn't need to bother with goodwill if the plan was to get rid of all the witnesses to their presence on the planet. But they wouldn't do that, would they? They were supposed to be the good guys. A nature-like contrast to the Imperials. They wouldn't just... Jason sighed as he stood up, unholstering his pistol as he moved to the back hatch. Then his eyes landed on something that might prove useful. Mabel was a big enough woman to admit that things weren't going quite as well as she might have liked. "Quit struggling!" The shark woman atop her shouted in badly mangled Orphean, as her colleague kept her weapon trained on her. "Then quit trying to stab my sky-stamped arm!" Mabel snapped back. "Then quit struggling!" This time it was the woman's partner who spoke. I don't even know why you're kicking up a fuss. You said you were going to take my loot. The woman atop her gritted her teeth. We said we were going to search your home for any contraband or items taken from our own supplies. As I said, steal my shit. Of course, that wasn't the real reason, she being less than willing to let the two off-worlders search her home, even if she was admittedly, if entirely reasonably protective of her stash of off-worlder tech. She wasn't quite so foolish as to physically get into an altercation with two armed soldiers over it. And given the way the woman atop her had so effortlessly pinned her, it was clear these two weren't just any soldiers. They were skilled. Very skilled. Which she'd kind of already known, given that they were part of the group that had so effortlessly dismantled the Imperials, with so recently being the premier power on Ragnos. That was over now, though. So even as she continued to struggle, she found herself wondering why she had ever thought it was smart to go against said group. Oh yeah, because you're a sucker for a pretty boy in a bad situation, she thought bitterly. And Jason was very pretty, and in a very bad situation. Never mind the fact that it was clear to all and sundry that he barely thought of her as anything but a precocious savage, was just using her to get access to a means to save the real people. Nope. All it had taken was one good look at the defeated look on his pretty face, and her vagina had demanded she do anything she could to fix things. Which in this case was essentially giving away the single most valuable item her clan owned. Mum's gonna kill me, she thought. You know, if these two idiots don't do it first. Well, she'd had the thought mostly in jest. She felt her eyes widen as the woman atop her reached for something on her vest, speaking in that strange biting tongue of theirs to their partner. Said eyes only widened further as she laid eyes on a truly gigantic knife. Holy shit, they're actually going to kill her? She was the chief's daughter, they couldn't just... The door exploded. Jason took in the sight of the two shark-like women. One stood in the main hall, the other crouched over a very uncooperative-looking Maybell. 3 sets of eyes turned to stare at him in surprise. That half second of surprise was all he needed to draw a bead on the one on top Maybell and pull the trigger. It wasn't the world's most accurate shooting, as his pistol traced a line of shots across the Adixie. Still, it was enough, as something clearly failed in the armour, and the alien jerked violently as she flew off Maybell's prone form. Of course, the moment he'd drawn a bead on the first alien, he knew it had been a mistake, as that had given the second one ample time to get over her surprise and level her weapon at him. She didn't hesitate to pull the trigger, and Jason grunted in pain as a spine sprouted from his gut. The force of the shot knocked him back and slammed against the wall. He felt a heated dampness swarming around the bolt's entry point as he slumped to the floor, the breath driven from him by the blow. A sensation that only got worse as 2 more spines sprouted right next to the first, each shot feeling like someone was driving a hammer into his chest. That was when the Adixie woman made her own mistake. She stopped there. Perhaps she assumed 3 shots to be enough. Perhaps him being a male attributed to that. He didn't know, and he wasn't inclined to ask. Instead, he simply lay there, blood pooling around him as it dribbled down from his stomach, soaking his borrowed cloak. Then, and only then, did the Adixie spare a glance at her downed comrade, which was when he shot her. Fancy armour or not, at this range the woman's armour fared no better than her allies, and perhaps if Jason's breath hadn't already been driven from his lungs by being repeatedly shot in the abdomen, he'd have let out a sigh of relief as he heard her body drop to the floor. Then he shot her again, just to be sure. Silence reigned in the small cabin, broken only by his laboured attempts to get air back into a set of lungs that seemed determined to be uncooperative. Holy shit! Mabel finally cried, clambering out from under her captor's corpse and rushing over to him. Of course, that was the moment she seemed to realise what a state he was in, which wasn't surprising, given that her prone position had likely given her a very poor advantage on the proceedings. Oh, she said, hands awkwardly floating over the bolts, perforating his chest. Shit! She looked frantically towards the door. Stay here, I'll go get someone. He reached up to grab her before she could move. Don't bother. No time and no point, he coughed, finally getting some air into his lungs. That said, he finally clambered to his feet, despite Mabel's best attempts to bid him to stay still. We need to move now, before our friends' friends notice they're gone. Which might have happened already if Adixie armour functioned anything like the Imperial equivalent. The local Alliance commander should definitely have been made aware of 2 of her soldiers flatlining, which is why they needed to move fast, before the entire garrison was on their ass. We can't move, you're hurt, Mabel pointed out, as he started limping towards the boat shed. Less than you think, he responded, tugging on his cloak. The compromised material tore easily enough, dropping away to reveal a set of incredibly battered-looking Orphean armour. My old armour, she shouted. It protected you. He nodded, even if he wanted to point out that he didn't feel like a man that had been protected, because while the bronze breastplate had managed to stop the bolts from penetrating deeply, they had penetrated. He currently had 3 bolts stuck a few centimetres into his torso, and he felt it. More to the point, he was pretty sure he was sporting a cracked rib, or 2, from where the armour had dented under the force of the blows it had endured, which went some way to explain why every breath he took felt like agony, It also went some way to explain why he didn't feel like explaining all of that to Maybelle. That was wasted air, and he had precious little of that as it was. Glancing back, he found his eyes lingering on the down forms of the Adixi as he realised, belatedly, that this was the first time he'd actually gotten to get a good look at the aliens in the flesh. Grey-skinned, sightless blue eyes open in death, the aliens had the same broad features as the Chauvanti. The key difference, though, was that where the Chauvanti had a pair of tusks in the corner of their mouth, the Adixi had a mouthful of razor-sharp teeth. Also, what he'd originally assumed were dreadlocks were in fact long tendrils that sprouted from their head like hair, and ran all the way down to the midpoint of their back. It was strange to look at, as it didn't look like flesh or hair. It instead looked like the spines of a sea urchin, if a sea urchin's spines were floppy like hair. He also noted that their mottled grey armour was a midpoint between that of the Imperium and Consortium. Where Imperial armour was entirely skin-tight fabric, and the Consortium's was comprised of overlapping ceramics like plates, the Alliance seemed to use hard plates positioned over fabric, around the chest, the forearms, the thighs, any area that didn't see a lot of flex. 2 dead aliens, novel and new, in morphology, culture and technology, from a race he'd never even spoken to. It made him feel tired. "Just get in the shuttle," he muttered, as they stepped into the boat shed. It was time to blow this popsicle stand. Of course, it wasn't quite that simple. The local Alliance commander had definitely become aware of the death of 2 of her soldiers, and had responded with all the required alacrity to avenge them. Or perhaps she just noticed the giant mining shuttle exploding out of a nearby boat shed. Either way, Jason was currently flying circles around the settlement, trying to avoid laser fire. Invisible laser fire. "That one, there!" Maybelle shouted from his co-pilot seat. "Which?" he shouted back, yanking hard on the control stick. She leaned forward, wincing as a shower of sparks flew up around the windshield. "That, you missed it!" He scowled. "Say it sooner next time, then. All these tunnels look alike, and this thing handles like an apartment complex." "I don't know what that is." "It's a..." He cut himself off, as the craft suddenly stalled for a heart-stopping few seconds. Fortunately, it righted itself again a moment later. "Big building." Perhaps he'd been a little over-optimistic when he said that yellow only meant less than optimal, as opposed to liable to fail, because every now and then Foster suddenly seemed to remember that he had spent the last few months underwater, and cut out momentarily. Fortunately, that seemed to be happening less and less as time went by. Which was good, because they successfully come around to what he hoped was a tunnel entrance Maybelle had just pointed out. He supposed he was about to find out either way. If Maybelle started screaming in incoherent fear as he dove towards it, he'd know he picked the wrong one. Then again, the Orpheum woman had been screaming in near constant incoherent fear from the moment they'd taken off, so perhaps that wasn't quite the indicator he thought it was. Not that he blamed her, he was screaming too. The tunnel he was aiming for looked like the more of a giant beast as he did toward it, though not quite as giant as he might have liked, as he attempted to metaphorically thread the needle. "We're going to crash!" He might have made some argument against Maybelle's assertion as to their immediate doom, but to be perfectly honest, he wasn't entirely sure she was wrong. Fortunately for him, he was either the luckiest son of a bitch in the universe, or Rocket was a better teacher than she gave herself credit for, because soon enough, their rusty little mining shuttle was darting through the tunnel mouth with entire feet to spare. "We made it! I can't believe we made it!" the woman next to him breathed. Truth be told, neither could he, which is why he resisted the urge to point out that they hadn't technically made it yet. As evidenced by the loud crunch that rang through the hull of the craft when it demolished a low-hanging stalagmite as they sped through the dark tunnels, hovering barely more than a few feet above the water. Sure, the hardy little shuttle was only moving at about 40 kilometers an hour as it zipped along the underground pathway, but given that they were underground, any speed above that of a casual jog ran pretty close to suicidal. Fortunately for him, he had an able navigator in left, left, left! Jason jerked the ship to the left, angling it down another tunnel. Exhaling a small sigh of relief, he glanced at Maybelle. "Just so we're clear, you're totally sure that this route will take us to the surface, away from the mining nexus?" She nodded. "Absolutely." "And you're absolutely positive that this shuttle will fit?" "Almost positive." "Almost..." He cut himself off before he said something unkind. Perhaps it was the blood pooling in his seat, or the fact that breathing felt like gargling glass, but he decided almost positive would do. He winced as the shuttle winged another low-hanging stalagmite. "Are you sure the shuttle will be okay?" Maybelle asked, glancing at the myriad yellow lights that had lit up the console, many of which had been blue when they'd taken off. If it weren't for the fact that Jason's entire focus was on keeping their unwieldy craft from scraping against the rock walls or plunging into the water below them, he would have turned to look her dead in the eye. "Almost positive."